everyone, and welcome to Project Kin's special program today with Howard and Elvira and the love and the German chocolate cake. This is a very special program in that one of our most active longtime members, Lori Olson White, had been telling me and talking about little tidbits of this story as part of her Lost and Found story box. And I just loved it. And I asked her to just tell me a little bit more. And pretty soon I could see that this was a special kind of thing that maybe we could present as a variation on these project recipe ideas that we have. I'm always trying to mix it up and learn more and get more creative and find better ways to help people tell their stories. So here we are with an incredible story that I think is just perfect for Valentine's Day, as we are here today, just a couple of days away. So I'm going to turn it over to the recording first, and then we'll open it up for a conversation about these kinds of stories. So be thinking about that as we go along. Here we go.
In the spring of 1932, the people who had become my grandparents, Howard Summerall and Elvira Stelges, got engaged. To celebrate their betrothal, Elvira baked a German chocolate cake for Howard, who promptly proclaimed it the best cake he'd ever had. Elvira determined then and there that German chocolate cake was Howard's favorite, and thus a family tradition and a family story was born. My grandparents got married on January 1st, 1933, and although they had a white almond bride's cake at the reception, Grandma also insisted on having a small German chocolate cake for my grandpa. For the next 59 years, Grandma baked Grandpa's favorite cake for every one of his birthdays and every one of their anniversaries, save the 3 years he was aboard the USS Ocelot fighting the Japanese. It was, after all, his favorite. If anyone's counting, that's 116 German chocolate cakes, give or take a few. Fast forward to Thanksgiving of 1992. The table has been cleared, the leftovers put away, the dishes washed, and it's time to plan Grandpa and Grandma's upcoming anniversary party. Extravagant parties were a must-have for my grandma for any celebration ending in a 0, and this next one would be the big 6-0. Grandma had already begun work on her formal evening gown, and Grandpa's tuxedo had been serviced, but there were still 100 invitations to hand address, flowers to orders, and menus to finalize. Gathered as a family, we worked our way down the list: cocktails and mocktails, dips and spreads, finger foods, meats, and cheeses. When we got to the desserts, Grandma opened with German chocolate cake. Grandpa cleared his throat, then almost in a whisper said, "No German chocolate cake this year." "Of course we'll have German chocolate cake," Howard reminded Grandma. "It's your favorite." There was another long pause. "No, dear," said Grandpa. "It is not." You know how wildlife reacts to the first seconds of a total eclipse? That's how everyone at the table reacted to Grandpa's unexpected announcement. Everything got very, very quiet. After a bit, Grandpa explained. Back in the beginning, he'd been so flattered that the girl he'd fallen in love with would go to the effort of baking such a beautiful cake that he couldn't bring himself to tell Elvira he didn't really like chocolate, so he'd eaten it. And when he'd seen the big smile spread across her face as he ate that cake, he couldn't help but make a big deal about how delicious it was. Then Grandma joined in. She loved chocolate, but she'd always been a pie person herself. But when it came time for her to show off her homemaking skills, she'd remembered Howard pointing out a beautiful chocolate cake in the window of the local German bakery they'd walked past on one of their walking dates, so she decided to recreate that cake. She practiced making that cake for days, spending most of her Depression-era salary on the ingredients. Grandma was nervous about how the cake turned out, but then Howard's face had lit up like the 4th of July, and he'd eaten every last crumb. And he told her it was delicious, so right then and there, Grandma had decided she was going to make it for him as often as he liked. I can still remember how my grandparents laughed about that decades-long misunderstanding. My kids have heard that German chocolate cake story from 3 generations of storytellers. from me, from their grandma, and from their great-grandma, and they've passed the story down to their kids, my grandchildren. It's told when we see a German chocolate cake in the window of a local bakery, when we're celebrating special moments and milestones, and when we're just reminiscing about the people we love. In fact, the story is so ingrained in who we are that we use German chocolate cake as sort of a secret code to signal we're doing something because it will make someone else happy instead of ourselves. As an author, genealogist, and culinary historian, I always knew I would document and preserve my family's German chocolate cake story for future generations someday, and that point finally arrived in 2023. My plan was to find Grandma's recipe, flesh out the story a bit with some research, and maybe bake a cake with my grandkids. I went into my research with a few basic assumptions, forgetting for a moment that assumption is the mother of all mistakes. Assumption 1. German chocolate cake is a German recipe. It's right there in the name. Assumption 2. Grandma's recipe for German chocolate cake had been passed down by her German matriarchs, or failing that, she'd gotten it from someone in New Ulm, Minnesota, where she'd grown up. Again, German cake, German family, German town. Assumption number 3. Grandma always used the same recipe every time she made Grandpa's German chocolate cake. Samuel German was born December 15, 1802, in Biddeford, England. Not a lot is known about him other than that he ended up in Boston sometime around 1840. And a few years later, he was working as a floor cleaner for Edmund and Walter Baker, owners of Baker Chocolate Company. The story changes with the teller, but at some point, Samuel made the unexpected move from cleaner to food scientist, and in 1852, he formulated an entirely new kind of chocolate, a sugar-infused chocolate which would forever bear his name and confuse bakers and cooks everywhere. German's sweet chocolate. This new chocolate was perfect for fine, high-quality cakes, and commercial bakers quickly put it to work baking and selling German's chocolate cakes. Over time, however, people got lazy and dropped the apostrophe. German's chocolate cake became simply German chocolate cake, and the myth of its Germanic roots was born. So much for assumption number 1. Despite this new wrinkle and the implications it had on my second assumption, I still believed I could trace Grandpa's favorite cake back to a family baker. Carla is the daughter of my grandma's brother and one of the few members of that side of the family still around. She's also a skilled genealogist and kinkeeper, so if anyone had Grandma's family recipe for German chocolate cake, it was Carla. That's her in the white shirt with her mom, her brother, and our common great-grandma, Maggie. I called Carla up, explained what I was looking for, and asked for her help. A few days later, I got an email. Carla did have an old family recipe for German chocolate cake, she wrote, but she was fairly certain it had come from her mother's side of the family and not our common Stelgis side. I was surprised, but still pretty confident. I could absolutely find a thread. Carla's mom had been a wit, and her ancestors and my grandpa's Semrau family had roots in the West Prussian village of Goldau. In fact, the two families had intermarried a number of times. And the Wits in my Stelgis family had been neighbors back in New Ulm, meaning Grandma and Carla's mother had grown up together. The recipes may have been traded between the women of the family seemed entirely possible. Feeling like a big league hitter who was batting .500, I confidently moved on to my third assumption, that Grandma always used the 1932 recipe every time she made German chocolate cake. I figured the best way to confirm that assumption was to prove there was a mother of all recipes out there somewhere. Some people like to knit, some train for marathons. My dad, he loved to whittle. Me, I like to dig around in newspaper archives. So that's exactly what I did. I limited my search to recipes published after 1852 and to those containing the phrase German chocolate cake, with or without the apostrophe. And what I found was extraordinary. In the end, I gathered more than 100 unique historic recipes for what could, at least technically, be called German chocolate cake, meaning they included the sweet baking chocolate Samuel German had formulated, not that they had roots in Germany. And as I looked at the ingredients, the cooking methods, and even the flavor profiles, it became pretty clear that the German chocolate cake Grandma made for Grandpa in 1932 was probably not the same cake she made for him in 1942, or 1952, or even 1962. Like their relationship, the recipe, and the cakes Grandma made had evolved. The summer after first grade was a big one for me in a lot of ways, but mostly because it was the first summer I got to spend a full week by myself with Grandpa and Grandma at their house in Park Rapids, Minnesota. It was the beginning of a summer tradition that continued until I finished college, and the setting for some of my most cherished memories. Grandma taught me how to knit and crochet, how to play solitaire and fold linen napkins, and how to make Grandpa's favorite German chocolate cake. I was too young to know how important that cake was to our family, and in hindsight, I should have paid more attention. But I do remember the mess I made breaking pecans into pieces with Grandma's meat hammer, and also the sticky sweetness of the shredded coconut I was tasked with sprinkling over the top of the cake. As it turned out, those two memories were the only two I needed to understand the evolution of Grandma's German chocolate cake recipe. There's some argument about when, where, and especially who came up with the recipe which creates what most of us recognize as German chocolate cake today, a decadent, moist chocolate cake with gooey pecan and coconut frosting. The first recipe I found that included both pecans and coconuts was published in the Irving, Texas News Record in May 1956. A month later, a nearly identical recipe appeared in the Kiowa County Star Review out of Hobart, Oklahoma. By the end of 1956, similar recipes were popping up in newspapers and community cookbooks across Texas and Oklahoma. German chocolate cake as we know it was very much on the food scene. In 1958, Mary Jane Bodie, editor of the women's page in the Austin, Texas American Statesman, gave Lucille Moore, club cook at the Austin Women's Club, credit for creating the recipe. Lucille, she said, had been baking and serving up German chocolate cake with pecans and coconut since early 1957, and it was the club's best-selling dessert. General Mills, which had purchased Baker's Chocolate Company decades earlier, had a different origin story when they introduced their recipe for German's chocolate cake to the world in January of 1958. According to them, some of their people had heard buzz about a popular new cake recipe that featured coconut and pecans and their product, Baker's German's sweet chocolate. They went to Dallas and tracked the recipe to a woman named Margaret McAllister Clay, who had submitted it to a local newspaper. Sensing that this new recipe had financial promise, today we might say it had the potential to go viral, the big honchos at General Mills quickly acquired the recipe from Margaret and then turned it over to the company's test kitchen, where bakers, chemists, and food scientists eventually created the famous recipe for German's chocolate cake, which even today appears on each package of Baker's German's sweet chocolate, and which, it's entirely likely, was the recipe Grandma and I made together all those years ago. When I was searching for Grandma's recipe, when I thought it was just one recipe, I reached out to my sister to see if she had any memories of the German chocolate cake we'd grown up eating and the story it created. She didn't, she said. Most of her time at our grandparents' home had been spent with Grandpa out on the river looking for mud turtles or making something in his shop. A tomboy back then, my sister had rarely ventured into Grandma's kitchen. A few days later, I got a text message from her. Grandma probably just used a mix. We all carry around different memories and versions of a family story. To my sister, the story of Grandma's German chocolate cake was about a cake. And for a long while, I thought it was about a recipe, but it's not. For 60 years, Grandpa and Grandma made quiet sacrifices for the people they loved, for each other, for us, for their friends, even for strangers. That kind of love, the kind that shows up year after year in small, thoughtful ways, is the legacy they left us. And they left it to us in a story about a cake. We often think of love stories as grand gestures, but sometimes they're written on a flour-dusted recipe card or in a cake baked for decades out of sheer devotion. This Valentine's Day, heck, every day, I encourage all of us to think about the love stories in our own families, not just the big, dramatic ones, but the quiet ones, the special meals made out of love, the traditions carried on because they bring someone joy, the simple acts of devotion that have been passed on in kind across generations. In my family, one of those love stories started with a young couple and a German chocolate cake. That's where it began, but in retelling their story, my grandparents' legacy of selfless devotion lives on in my life and in the lives of my children and grandchildren. And like their love, I know it will endure because they showed us the way.
Wow, what a story. I think that's just a wonderful way to share the idea of storytelling, in many forms here in a video, but also in the love of a cake. I want to turn it over. You have heard now, Lori. I'm going to turn it over to you to say a few words, and then we'll just go ahead and open it up. Go ahead, please, Lori.
Well, thanks. Thanks for coming. This is a story, that I grew up with. I remember it being told one way, for all of my childhood for sure, and then and believing every second of it because it came from my grandparents. Of course, it had to be true and exactly how that happened. And so then when I got a little more curious, and I thought it's a story I really wanted to dig into. Um, and we tend to think about family stories, at least I do, as kind of being sacred. You don't question them. You don't dig around too deep in them, because you don't want the magic to go away, right? You don't want it to be any less than you think it is. And so when I started doing this research, there was some trepidation, of course, but from the way I see it, I haven't taken anything away from the story. I've added to it. I've added a lot. I think, I've added that, the grandma and grandpa, this was a gift of the Magi for them. It was all about, grandma doing what she thought would make grandpa happy, and grandpa doing what he knew would make grandma happy. And so, yeah, I think it's just one of those stories that's a good reminder of why we keep telling family stories, and why we shouldn't be afraid to um, think a little harder about it and see, maybe pull back the curtain and see what's back there. So that's kind of what I know about it.
That's brilliant. That's a perfect moment because, in fact, I tend to think about what I loved about the story is that universality of it. In our family, we kind of have the same story with a completely different skin. In our story, when our kids were little, I remember a visit to LA and spending time with a cousin who had a baby about the same age as our kids, and she loved to go thrift shopping and to garage sales. And we went to garage sale. Somebody was an old teacher, and she was reselling those Scholastic magazine books, kids books, little paperbacks, and among them was a book called George and Martha. And it was all the story. I will include this link. It was a story about George and Martha and how Martha loved making split pea soup, and George loved the split pea soup. Well, of course, he didn't actually love the split pea soup. Oh yeah, and the two of them are hippopotamuses.
Yeah.
And he would always put his split pea soup into the boot, into the shoe, and so on and so forth. It's the same story. It's just in a different skin
Yeah.
with
Oh, Henry,
hippopotamuses.
right?
Oh,
And oh,
Henry,
Henry,
gift of the
right?
Magi.
Yeah, with Della and Jim, it's the same story. Yeah.
Exactly.
Which is
So
because it's universal, right?
exactly.
We do things for other people that we love.
Right.
Um,
So let me do this right now. I'm going to open it up and encourage all of you to go ahead and turn on your camera if it's not there, if you're comfortable. Don't have to if you don't want to. And open up that mic, and you have stories just like this. Go ahead and tell us. You know you want to.
the other part of the story for me, at least, is also just, you know, we all have food in our family that is an expression of love. And buttered noodles is for me. My husband is a big one for. He grew up in Texas, and he's a big one for red beans and rice with little wieners cut up. And so we all have those things that those foods that comfort us, that are expressions of love because somebody else made them for us first.
Right.
And I think that's just so universal in all of this, and something that I just love kind of playing around with. So,
Yeah. Yeah. It is that
Cynthia.
that sense of soul that speaks to the soul of a family. Yeah.
I
Feel free to jump on in. Go ahead.
I'm Cynthia. I'm in Seattle. It's my first time joining, so this is really great. Um, I the thing that comes to mind for me is it's kind of funny. It was interesting that you brought up. I think one of my favorite twists in this story was your sister saying, "Oh, she might have just used a mix." I
Right?
thought that was hilarious. But then that also reminds me that sometimes we take for granted that all of these family traditions are everything was from scratch and my
Are
mom
big.
this recipe and it's unique to us somehow or something. So my version of that, I guess it's kind of, it's relatively simple. But at Thanksgiving, it was never a Thanksgiving without the ground, cranberry orange relish, the fresh one, that's very, very simple. And and I just, I always loved it. And for the longest time, I thought that that was like a special recipe of my mom's. Kind of, I mean, I didn't know better. And she passed away like 25 years ago, and I have her big beat up recipe folder. And in there, going through it one day, I don't know, 18 years ago or something, I came across the clipped out, recipe from the back of the ocean spray bag, and I was
Right?
like, well, it was everybody's, secret recipe, secret family version of that. And she never was like trying to hide it. It's just that I assumed that it was, and it's funny, that's a story I've heard, I've been sharing. I've started, I've been going down a deep recipe box rabbit hole.
It's fabulous. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So I've been having a lot of conversations with people, and I just think it's hilarious how often that comes up. I thought, like another one was a friend who talked to her mom, um, you know, relatively recently, said, "Hey, mom, what's that great pie crust you always made? Because you always made the best pies." And she never thought to ask her mom, and it ends up she used the Pillsbury pre-made pie dough from
Right?
the freezer. It's like, well, if it's good enough for mom, maybe I should give it a try, So
Nestle Toll House cookies, right? Everybody's
exactly
mom's recipe. Every grandma. It's like that.
right,
They write it down and they're like, these are the same recipes.
exactly. And I like to remind people that that doesn't discount the fact that it has a valid part of your family story, and that you can still find a story in it and find a way that it means something unique to your family. And just because it came off the back of a box, or, seems really mundane, I so encourage folks to, like, well, then ask a few more questions and learn a little bit more about, like, when did you always serve it, and what are memories people have around it, and all the other things around it are what make it special, even if the recipe
Absolutely.
itself might be kind of straightforward, right?
Yep. Yeah. And it's for me, a lot of times those recipes aren't so much even about like it's a great recipe or it holds up to time. It's that I remember somebody making it for me, or a time when I ate it and I needed something, and that person brought me this, and I felt better. All those meetings that we associate with family food and comfort food. It's just like you said, it's a rabbit hole you can just keep going down because we all have those stories. And we kind of I think for myself, I kind of take them for granted sometimes. That I mean, I grew up eating this, so of course I'm going to like it. But when you start peeling back the layers, a lot of times it's because of an event or a day that was just a hellish day, and this food showed up. Things like that. That it just we have those strong ties and to food.
Mhm.
Thanks.
All of you again are welcome to go ahead and turn on your microphone and join on in. I mean, a simple question that I have is, what's your favorite food that you remember, or that you remember being passed down within your family? You've already mentioned, for me, the cranberry. I was going to say, oh, that one. Oh, Toll House cookies. Oh, for that one. I remember discovering that my brother didn't really like chocolate. I would always be making him Toll House chocolate chip cookies, and I didn't know he didn't like chocolate. It still astonishes me. So I made
Like my
Ranger
grandpa,
cookies for him. Yeah, I
60
made
years of
Ranger
all
cookies.
the gooeyest, chocolatiest thing you can imagine, a German chocolate cake. And he's like, yeah, I don't really like chocolate 60 years later.
That's
I
love.
started making
Right? That's
Ranger
love.
cookies.
Absolutely.
That is love. That defines it.
It
That
does.
defines it.
Yeah. And the other thing, and I mentioned it in the video too, is that we use that term all the time in our family now. When you're doing something, even like we'll be, like my husband will say, what do you want to watch on? What movie do you watch? And he picks like Bloodsport or something, and I'm like, okay, that sounds good. And he'll like, is this a German chocolate cake moment? And I'm like, absolutely, that's what this is. So it's just kind of, yeah, it's just part of it. It's part of who we are, I guess.
Yeah. I started making the chocolate chip cookies in Christmas batches of goodies that I would send to relatives and everybody. And I started adding my in-laws. only to discover that, yeah, my brother makes chocolate chip cookies now with his grandson. And the biggest fan of my Ranger cookies was my father-in-law. And now he's like, bring cookies, send cookies. Okay. That's all you want to say to me. That's fine. I'm glad you enjoy them. You have stories. So I also want to point out the cleverness of the way in which you put this story together as a film and why it worked so well as a film. It worked well. You sent me the script earlier, and I could, I can repeat it in my head now listening to it because I read through that very carefully edited, beautifully put together script. And then it works so well as a slideshow, as a film, because of the thoughtfulness of each of the moments and the clever intertwining of the humor summary to go ahead and say the things that we're feeling and thinking about, but you've saved little bits. It's just so beautifully executed, just as your writing is. And I think
Thanks.
that's the kind of thing that I want everybody to see how important it is to tell these stories, to get these shared. And yes, thank you, Cynthia. It motivates us to go back and look for those stories, to go ahead and articulate the things that we just know. I think that's maybe what a lot of us are trying to do at this time in our lives, is to go ahead and say the things that, yeah,
Mhm.
we always knew. And it's, we never only think about saying them then.
And articulate the meaning. For me, that's a big part of the process too. It's like, I know the stories, they're internalized, we know them, but then just setting aside time to think about why that story is still being told in our family, and what it says about us as a family, and in my case, just the legacy that my grandparents left for all of us. um, you know it's a silly cake recipe that changed probably at least 15 times over a 60-year period. So it's not the recipe, that's not the story. But it's thinking hard enough to bring up the memories about why it's so important to me. Was really just a it was just a I mean, even if I had never written it, it was just good for me. Yeah, well, I'll say that it was good for me.
I think putting it in the terms of a legacy is really an important way to think about it. What is the legacy that you're leaving to your children? That's too big a question. But the question of, yeah, we always do X. We always put the Christmas tree here. We always have Thanksgiving table this way. I mean, holidays, because they are, national holidays or religious holidays or a thing that everybody can agree to. I have a cat on my back here. That these make it more of a universal, and then you can say, well, this is what we always did. Is a way it identifies the thing, and then that becomes a legacy. So why is it a legacy? What is it important? Knowing the right questions to ask then lets you get to articulate what it is that's important.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned something that all we always have this tradition, and I remember after my grandparents had passed away, and we always had Christmas at their house. My mom was an only child, so that we always had Christmas at their house, and after they passed away, I remember one Christmas my mom saying, "Well, we need to have the oyster stew because we always have that at Christmas," and I'm like, I mean, I'm 36 years old. I've never had oyster stew in 36 Christmases. So where does this come from? And it turns out that when she was little, her grandma would make oyster stew. And even though it had been missing for all those Christmases, she wanted it back. And I think about when you embed a tradition into your family, whatever kind of a tradition it is, we always think, well, it's going to be every year we're going to do that, and there's a lot of pressure around that, like, oh God, I got to make the whatever, but we don't, because here, this was a big gap, and it was still important to Mom that at Christmas time that was something that she wanted. So the whole tradition thing is just, it fascinates me. It fascinates me.
It's funny you mentioned oyster stew. I didn't grow up on the mainland US, and I came out here to go to college. I'd never known any of my cousins or grandparents or anything. And I had the opportunity to spend time with my great aunt, my grandmother's sister, who lived nearby. So I remember one spring, while I was in college, she says, "We're going to make oyster stew." And I said, "Okay." I didn't think I liked oysters, but I was keeping my mouth shut. So the whole day was about these oysters, so about the oyster stew, because of course we had to go get the oysters. And I'm here in California, we're on the coast, we actually have oysters. We all get into the car with a good friend of theirs who's in her 90s. The two of them are in their late 80s. I'm in the back in a Camry van and or station wagon, and we go all the way out to Tamales Bay. We go harvest or buy the oysters, come all the way back to Orinda, go all the way up, and begin making the oyster stew. What is oyster stew? As far as I could tell, it was oysters boiled in milk. It was the nastiest thing. The nastiest thing. I don't like hot milk much. And at the time, I love them now. At the time, I didn't like oysters. So imagine fishy, salty, hot milk. What's the point? But by golly, I loved it. As far as my face would say. And yet I adored my aunt. And somehow there was something so charming about that moment where they were so excited. And of course, my great uncle shows up with his Yale 14 t-shirt from Yale 1914, which of course was new from sometime in like the 60s or 70s, because he was the class 1914, and it was a
Nice. So how many more times did
moment.
you have to eat oyster stew when you were at that family?
Well, it was thankfully it was just that I would only see them for a week at a time, or a few days at a time, and it didn't seem to correspond with oyster season.
Well, I think my mom's
But
oyster stew came right out of a can. So, I mean, it wasn't that there was, we lived in
warm,
Minnesota.
salty,
Where were we
briny milk with
where were we
canned
going to get,
oysters.
where were we going to get oysters? It's Minnesota in December. I mean, come on. But so it wasn't about the food. It really wasn't about the food. It was about the memory. And I think that's the fun part of looking at our culinary history, because it's so rarely about the food. It's the food is just like a vessel. It's not the food.
It never was about the food. What a great moment. What a great statement. It never was about the food.
Yeah,
Linda, I see
yeah.
you've taken, come on in, join the party.
Well, Grandma used to make Springerles, and I don't know where the recipe is, but she would make it. And I'm not going to tell the story because I'm going to write about it. But the whole thing is about where she did it on the table. Anyway, but she made Springerles, and she made there's something else she made that are all meringue. God, I can't think what those things are called. But I love those, and I hated Springerles. I just thought they were awful. And but anyway, I would eat them because she made them, and you just kind of did that. Well, it's funny because I ended up like probably 10 years ago taking a Springerle class, and but I tried to make them, and I've got the roll, and somebody gave me a roll, and then I also the thing that and then I ended up buying some, and I still haven't done it, but I'll buy Springerles now, and I really love them. And it's funny because I
You have to
didn't.
tell us what a Springerles are.
Oh
We have no
gosh,
idea.
it's an anise flavored cookie, and they're decorated. They're usually about like this, and they're hard and they're soft in the center. You don't have Donut Bank. We have the places that make them at Christmas, and then there's also there's a the sister's home in Ferdinand that makes them every Christmas, and they sell them. So we'll make a trip up there and get some. But it's a anise flavored, and
Are they the ones that have the print, like the imprint on the top?
yeah, because you have either a roll
Yep.
or you
Yep.
have a stamp,
A
and
stamp. Yep. Yeah.
but they're just. But I remember her in
Fantasy.
the kitchen making them, and I didn't like them at all. And I thought, "Bah, these are terrible." And then as I got older, I thought, I'm gonna taste them. And of course, she was long gone. And now I absolutely love them, but I'll buy them. I'm not sure I'm gonna make them.
What about you, Cynthia? You've been going through a lot of recipes. I've been following you for a while, and so what kind of things have you found that maybe you haven't written about yet, or something that just kind of hit you as far as your own personal culinary history?
Um, Sorry, I've had a cold, so I'm gonna sound like a frog. Um, the oyster story reminds me, my family does have a long tradition of having oyster dressing at Thanksgiving and Christmas, and I'm gonna ask my mom because I don't know if that came from her mom's side or her dad's side, but it was a must at every family holiday. And as people started to pass away, we don't have it anymore. Um, I liked it, but a lot of people don't. But it's I know what Barbara's talking about, the hot milk. I know with the dressing, it's not as intense because it's mixed with so much broth and other, bread and things. But that and the thing that one of my relatives made that I did not like, and I still don't like it, is chocolate pie. I love chocolate, but I don't like chocolate pie like with meringue. And don't want to offend anybody, but we always called them calf slobbers. They were on top. Because, they would get that kind of moist layer between the meringue and the pie, and I just couldn't. But my great aunt, who lived to be 100 years old, would always make chicken and dumplings and chocolate pie. And I would sometimes spend a week with her in the summer. And I was always like, oh, I have to eat this. But yeah, I mean, I have fond memories of it, but I don't want chocolate pie again. But yeah, that's what it made me think of.
Yeah. The other Cynthia, what about you?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I'm the youngest of my family, and like I said, I have my mom's recipe folder, but the thing I wish I had done, and I have all of her recipes basically, and some of which, are family favorites and such in there. But the thing I wish I had done and didn't was talk to my mom more about the recipes obviously while she was around, and even when I was like a teenager or college kid. I wish I had had the foresight to talk to her more about them and get not only like, I like this recipe, we serve it, you serve it at holidays or whatever it might be, but to hear more about her cooking story, who she learned it from, how long she's cooked it, what her memories were associated with it. So that's kind of one of my regrets that I try to share with I mean, not to share regrets, but to
Mhm.
encourage other people to, if you don't already have the story, the recipe's one thing. Like we've decided, it's not just about the recipe, it's not just about the food, it's about what that calls to mind, what it means for your family and all that kind of stuff. So I think that's part of it. So I'm going to sit down with my sister, and I have older sister and brother, and I'm going to sit down with both of them and go through these folders because I know what I remember and associate with our family, but I can't wait to hear more about what they remember because they're 7 and 11 years older than me. So they have a whole lot of different family history. Um, the one thing that's kind of fun or it's just part of the nature of my family, is my dad was in the Navy and moved a lot. And so there's some recipes that mom picked up over the years from travels and from other people she met. So randomly, like she would make fish curry, which is definitely not part of our family tradition, but she learned it somewhere along the way. So to have a fish curry with all the little bowls alongside, and that was like a thing, even though it has zero to do with our own heritage and experience as a family. but it's just part of the inner, the mishmash of influences my mom had over the years. So that's pretty fun. And my mom, I have to give her credit. She was really good about making notes on recipes. So it'll be, I got this from, Mrs. Collier in 1962, or we were in Rhode Island, or stuff like that. And I love those little bits of sort of family, you know, history. And everybody knows this. I think this is so cool when you pick up a recipe and it's written on the back of something, like it's the back of I don't know, a receipt,
Grocery list.
a grocery list, or because that's part of the story too. As you flip it over, sometimes you're like, oh, I forgot we lived, my family lived in Rhode Island, and there's this thing from somewhere in Rhode Island or whatever. I just think there's so many treasures in there, again, beyond the recipe itself, right?
Right.
And it just sparks a lot of fun and a lot of reminiscing and a lot of understanding family history. And I just think they're golden. I just love the recipe
I do
box.
too.
I'm just all about the recipe box.
I do too. I think that, it's such a overlooked aspect of family history, I think, because it's women's work primarily, and women just got about the business of cooking. A lot of times our ancestry, or the women in our families didn't think that cooking was just something they had to do. A lot of times they didn't do a lot of creativity. My mom's generation, my grandma made everything from scratch. Well, according to my sister, she used a box, but my grandma I remember her doing everything from scratch. And then my mom came along, and my husband and I have this conversation all the time. I hardly remember my mom making anything from scratch. It came out of a box. It came out of a can. I mean, she was like all about convenience foods, because that was the move in the culture. And now we're moving kind of back towards that, for a lot of different reasons. I cook from scratch for everything. But how we look at food has changed a lot, I think. And so it's something that's overlooked, the stories behind those recipes, and even things like the utensils they used, or I've got like my grandma's old tin teaspoon, and her old, the thing that you roll dough out on, a dough roller pad, or whatever. There's so much history that we just kind of forget is in the food that we eat, and the food that we love, and that has all these meanings to us. So I love that whole idea.
I want to come back to something you said, Cynthia, about traveling, living lots of different places and where things came from. Many of us have family who are immigrants, and finding ways, talk about a connection of food and culture, finding ways to bring those family stories. And to your point, fundamentally, Lori, about articulating the thing that is what makes it important. I think finding ways to invite in those family members who have the origin story for the thing that is so important, and getting them to tell them. As you're telling all of this, I'm thinking about my Chinese mother-in-law, who grew up in Shanghai before the war, and has stories from a lot of that, but here in America has been making and teaching Chinese cooking, and showing our daughters how to make dumplings of various kinds, and what you fold and what you bring in and what you pinch and where each of these kinds of stories. You can read them. It never was about the food. You can read those, but how do you bring those layers out in a way that overcomes barriers of language, barriers of memory, barriers of conversation? As we're talking about this, honestly, I think what I'm going to do is see if I can organize a Zoom call and have somebody present, my sister-in-law maybe, who sit with her and encourage her, and get my daughters on the other side, and perhaps some of the cousins, to listen and ask questions. I think it would be really powerful and help get those stories told. And oh yeah, by the way, she's also a really good cook, so the dumplings are amazing. There are a lot of those kinds of things, right?
And bringing in, telling our migration stories through the food, right? My whole family is German. We all came between 1869 and 1887. But you know, the pork hocks and, you know, all of those really hardcore German foods, man, I mean, we would have pork hocks and sauerkraut once a week at my house. And my dad was a third or fourth generation American, you know, but we carried those with us. Now, I mean, we were in Athens with our daughter and son-in-law, and we went to a German restaurant and we got those. And I'm like, dang, I remember how good these were. Why don't I ever make these at home? But you know, telling that the story of how the food traveled with our people, whether it's across an ocean or across the country or across the state or from a big city to a little town, or, you know, however. One of my favorite books is 97 Orchard. And I don't remember who wrote it, but it's a story about, it's a nonfiction book about this tenement building in New York City. And the author goes through from the time the tenement was built, and then each successive group of immigrants that came through and how they changed the food scene in that neighborhood. And there's actually a museum now in that spot in New York City, but fabulous story of how immigrant food changed a community. And it's one of my favorite books, and I recommend it all the time because it's like at the core of how our food scene changes, not artificially, not like, oh, micronutrient kind of way, but just organically, because people move in and out. It's a great book. Go get that book.
Yeah. By the way, that's a great point. I'm going to be including links for a lot of these kinds of things, including looking up recipes for things like Horcocks and Springerlees. You all are going to have to help me because I don't even know how to spell that.
Yeah.
But please do send those
German.
in. I love including these kinds of things as links and in the show notes, and it adds value and sparks the conversation, because that's really what this is about. You tell this one, I'll tell you my story about making German Stollen, because our Reese family, my dad is German. He's not German.
He's not German.
German Swiss. No. Anyway, I still make it. It's really good.
Yeah. I several years ago, I found a book there used to be German American cookbooks that came out in the after the third wave of German immigrants came through in America. There were a lot of people that wrote traditional German recipes, and they would have them in German, and then they adapted them to what was available in America as far as, you know, spicing and techniques and all those things. And so I've got one of those old books right here. And it has the German recipe, and then it's got the American, you know, the English version of it with the changes that, you know, the cookbook author made to make it like, you can't get this here, but you can get this instead, and it works, you know. I love those old books too.
Check and see if Springerlees are in there.
I will do that.
Yeah. Now, have you had Springerlees, Lori?
I have done those. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't like anise at all, but yeah, I have made them before.
Yeah. And we always ate spare ribs in sauerkraut. We didn't.
Rotten. Yep.
And what were you saying with your sauerkraut?
Pork hocks.
Pork hocks. Oh, we would do the spare ribs.
So pig ankles, which super delicious sounding, right? Super delicious sounding.
Hey, Linda. Linda and I are actually from the same town. I don't live there now, but we're from the same place. And Springerlees were huge.
Well, there's a lot of German people because we've got the German Manticore, and, you know, it's really a big settlement. A lot of my German people came from Cincinnati after Germany, Cincinnati, and then to Evansville. Yeah. So it's
my grandmother always had them. Yeah.
Did she have them too? Yeah.
Yeah.
And remember what those other things were that were like like egg whites, but they were there's another
Divinity.
Yes.
Divinity.
Divinity. She used to make Divinity too. That was really good. That's really sweet.
Yeah. Yep. What about, we
Wow.
haven't heard from Carrie or Jolene or Karen. Do you guys have any food stories? Any recipes? Any?
You know, I am just getting ready, as Barbara knows, to do the second edition of our family cookbook that I did a year ago. Because after getting it out, there were family members that showed up who wanted to be a part of the family cookbook who did not respond in the first round. And so,
Shocking.
yeah. So, you know, your story made me think very much, which is already in there, about my grandmother's chocolate pie. My grandfather was and I know someone here said they didn't like chocolate pie, which I just think is horrifying. But my grandfather loved pie of all kinds, and my grandmother made him one every day for as far back as I can remember.
Wouldn't
And
you love to
so,
have that menu, right? A
holy
daily
crap,
menu of
right?
pies?
Well,
Man.
my favorite was chocolate pie. And so I remember standing in her kitchen as a kid with her teaching me to make chocolate pie. Now, the thing that happened though is, if any of you have old chocolate pie recipes from grandparents, they always had a very flat, gooey meringue. And that's kind of sometimes how you can tell that it's somebody's grandmother's recipe, because the meringue is super flat. So my mother then developed or found, I'm not really sure which, a meringue recipe that doesn't get all the gooiness and stands up tall. So now what's in the family book is the combination of my grandmother's recipe and how my mother then changed it. And then it came into my generation of I make it with the combined pieces. So but I know for certain my grandfather loved pie because he ate it at every meal. So he ate pie of all kinds all day long. So anyway, that's what made me think of Barbara. And I am in my movement toward a second family cookbook right now with the related stories. And so it's a lot. It's a lot of fun.
Wonderful.
You know,
I'll
have you ever read?
include a link to that talk you did, and
On the first
details
edition.
included that. Absolutely. Go
Yeah.
ahead, please.
Carrie, have you ever read the book Sweet Land of Liberty, American History Through Pies? You got to get it. Fabulous book. I reviewed it when it first came out. It's by Rossi Anastopoli, and I'll throw it to Barbara, and she can put it in the notes. But it's great because it talks about the history of America through pies, and
That's awesome.
super fun. It's like talks about like why we like apple pie and where it came from, and I mean it's just like I think my favorite chapter is about lemon chiffon pie.
Yeah.
Right, because people thought it was very classy and fancy, and then Jell-O showed up, and you could make lemon chiffon pie out of a Jell-O mix, and people were like, "Look at me, I'm making this great,
Look at me making this fancy pie."
Yeah,
well, the thing I'm running into right now is my favorite aunt is dead, and she only had boys. And nobody seems to have recipes from her. And I've talked to her best friend, and I've talked to her granddaughters, and and nobody seems to have recipe. And my mother finally said, I don't think she cooked like that. I think her recipes were opening some cans and throwing stuff together. So I haven't figured out what to do exactly with that yet, because I want her to be in the cookbook, but so
put
there's
them in
just
there.
Challenges like that, that
Put
come
them in,
along when
right?
you're doing family. Yeah.
Yeah.
She was quite the lady. So but yeah, the sons have locked up all of her stuff and won't let any of us have any access to it. And so I'm hoping I can resolve that over time. So, but anyway, the pies were what it made me think of.
Yeah. Ruth, thanks for coming. Thanks
Oh,
so
of course.
much.
I like I said, I'm in the middle of this myself for a second run, so I wanted to come and see what the German chocolate cake thing, kind of what it had going on.
Great. Ruth, thanks for coming
Yeah,
too. I just saw you pop in.
I'm sorry to be so late. I just found out about it this minute. So I was on another call for a while. So anyway, a wonderful discussion. I'm so sorry I missed it, but thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. We're just, I'm sure you have a lot of stories too in your family about recipes that or food traditions that maybe were more an expression of love than something that people really ate or like to eat. And that's kind of what we're talking about.
Oh, that's great. I hope I can see the recap of what everybody wrote. Yeah, I really kind of, that's my blog. It's called Ruth Talks Food at Substack, ruthtalksfood.substack.com. And I've been writing it for 5 years now, almost.
Yep.
Believe it or not, I started during the pandemic with 10 subscribers.
Right.
I'm not very good at promoting myself, but it's a labor of love, because I think, I have a lot of stories to tell too, and food was a way of expressing our love in our family, and is still my way of doing it. And a lot of the stories that I write have to do with family. And we were immigrants to this country. My parents were, and I was first generation, and a lot of the food was just the way our family gathered, and the recipes. I mean, I have a book that's tattered and torn and almost hard to read, really, of my mother's recipes, but I still really cook, honestly, the way she did, even though she didn't really show me. But I don't know if others, and as for I think you were talking about German cookery, right? And my father's side was German, and a lot of the food that I grew up with had a German influence. And there are even books in my library that I can't read that are written in German, that my father would tell my mother what the recipes were, and she had translations and tried to make them, So
Yeah.
it's great. I don't know what others have said. Are you all talking about your family recipes and how you've translated them? Mm-hmm.
We're kind of talking around the topic of it's not always about the food. It's about the memories, right?
Right.
And I think that's kind of it's personally, I think that our culinary heritage is really kind of an overlooked piece of our family history. And it's there for a lot of reasons, but I think we can all agree that it's foundational to our family history. And so telling those stories, however we tell them, whether we tell it like Barbara was talking about, having a Zoom and bringing in her family members and talking about the recipes and maybe doing some cooking shows or something. I don't know. Maybe that's not in your plan, Barbara, but how we remind everybody how important our culinary heritage is, and what it is, and why we should be passing those stories along, just the same as what happened to Annie Myrtle's balloon lady or whatever. There's all those stories that revolve around our expression of love through food.
I think that's true. And the point you made about that it's less the food than the stories that go around them. I mean, sometimes the food wasn't great, and yet it's still attached to our memories. I mean, honestly, there are things that my mother made, honestly, I wouldn't make, or the way she made them. I mean, she put a lot of things in them where, 50s, a lot of that kind of artificial stuff, and margarine, and, because they thought it was better and all that kind of stuff. But it's still very attached to memory and to stories. So,
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Ruth had a story, I think it was maybe a couple weeks about funeral food, and I had done a funeral food story maybe a little before that. And I was talking about, in Minnesota, we had funeral food that was ground up bologna sandwiches.
Yeah.
There's nothing good about that, but man, I mean, I can't go to a funeral and not have bologna sandwich, ground up bologna funeral spread. It's what we do.
It's absolutely it.
You had
my
some
family food was the way. I mean, apparently there's a story, and I'm not even absolutely sure it's true, but that one of my cousins, was staying at my grandmother's house and borrowed her car and crashed it into a tree when he was like a teenager, and came home just like absolutely, terrified of what grandma would say. And her first thing was, "Oh, poor boy, you must be hungry."
That is like the perfect expression of love in a perfect little nugget. I've cracked up the car, but honey, you must be hungry.
Right.
I mean, food is an expression of love. It's also an expression of culture. And in some ways, I think our cultures, as they get passed on, are like the distilled love of those who loved us before, whom you will never know, and let me pass it down. You know, it's this has been such a fabulous experience and moment. Lori, I knew we would find something to talk about. As we close this up, I want to remind all of you, and even those of you who came late, thank you so much for coming. The whole program is recorded, and not just recorded, but we're also adding in tips and tricks, and most of all, recipes and links and book suggestions, and follow-ons and blog links to Substacks. I'm going to insert one more,
Great.
which is Hannah, I can't remember her last name, who collects community cookbooks, and all of the stories behind all of those. These are the kinds of things that are so important. And I think they're also important to, quite frankly, what I'm trying to build here, which is a community. If I'm a ringleader, you know, I was thinking about this, Lori, maybe this is a troop. And in being a troop, I think we're all contributing. Thank you so much, Ruth. I got that. You're definitely in there.
Okay.
Bringing all of this together and supporting each other and encouraging each other to tell these stories in whatever form they come in. They need to be told. They need to be passed down, because that's where the love is. And let's face it, we need more of that than ever today.
Well, that's great. I hope you do another one of these. It's really, you know.
Oh, stay tuned.
Okay.
Stay
Great.
tuned and welcome to the community. There's a whole
Thank you.
catalog of events. Thank you for asking.
Yeah.
Are at projectkin.org/events. We
Oh,
do several of these a month, in various forms, focusing on various parts of the story with our members. I'm looking at you now. With our members contributing just as Lori did here, to step up with an idea. And I am delighted to bring the community together to tell these stories, because I do think that's important. And yeah.
Can I just add one thing? You know, I think, and Barbara and I have talked about this before, you know, I'm a big table family history person. You know, I think that there's just, I'm sorry. I know we're going over. She's like
No.
tapping her watch.
No,
I'm a big family
let me
person.
back up though. Big family table person.
Yeah.
Can you repeat
Yeah.
that one? What do you mean by that?
You know, the table is big in family history. It's a big table, and we can have all sorts of different aspects of family history, and our food history is absolutely got to be on that table. And so I'm super excited, Ruth, that you showed up. It's fabulous, because you're the stories that you're telling are family history stories.
right.
And you know, and we all have different aspects of stories that our family carries. And you know, a big table. We got a big table in this family history community here on Substack, and I just want to invite everybody to that table. So I'm super excited to hear.
Much. I really appreciate it. Again, my apologies for coming late. I just saw it, but it was fun.
Great, great, super good.
And I have, you know, Cynthia, thank you for your Substack. I have many of you, Cynthia Raleigh, I know your Substack. As you've contributed in, I'll do my best to include those in the notes here. And insider tip, if you think I might have missed something or you want to suggest one, feel free to drop me a DM, drop me a message, any, you know, email, anything that works, any way you know how to reach me, and I'll do my best to get it in there. I also sneak around every now and then and slip things in on an edit. Who knows?
Oh, okay.
So always happy to do that. This is about the community, is about our shared stories. And I'm just delighted to have such a burst of activity, energy, and most of all, love.
Oh, it's great.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. You know, I was a little scared to do this, but it was lovely seeing some familiar faces, and I just can't shut up. So, all right, everybody, thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye now. Thank you, everyone.